Welcome to episode 73 of No Rares Required, a weekly podcast focused on the top performing commons and uncommons in draft or limited in a specific color pair or archetype. And this week we have two archetypes left, Golgari, black-green, which we'll cover first. Theme on MTG Arena is Gravebreak, which, again, they did a pretty good job this time around. You're trying to collect evidence from your graveyard. And it's kind of something that is done within the Sultai space. So green, black, blue. And so every week I like to start things off with going over my draft skeleton, which is a strategy that I like to build before going into the draft to kind of keep in mind what are the key commons and uncommons that I'm looking for in an archetype. So it's made up of 17 commons, 5 uncommons, and 1 rare. And this allows me to kind of have a consistent strategy to shoot for, since you're going to see the commons and uncommons the most during a draft. And like I mentioned, you can easily make this into a Sultai space and go 3 color. I tend to focus on 2 color archetypes and splash kind of sparingly, but it's a personal choice. You know, there are many correct ways to play Magic. And so you do have really good fixing like Nervous Gardener, Tusker, Topiary Panther. To an extent, like They Went This Way. Like there's a lot of cards that allow you to play in a multicolored space, especially whenever green is involved. Personally, though, I like to stay more focused. And either way, your advantage is coming from collecting evidence from your graveyard. And one thing to keep in mind with this strategy is that it takes time. It is not particularly aggressive to be trying to fill your graveyard and then eventually outvalue your opponent from that resource. So you're going to want cards that are defensive and slow the game down. Vidogazi Inspector is very good at slowing things down. A 2/4 body with reach works especially well. It slows down the flyers. You also have a ton of removal at your fingertips in Golgari. You've got like Crowl Whipcracker, which is the Golgari signpost, can remove a token. Extract a Confession, Long Goodbye, Murder, Bite Down on Crime, Undercity Eliminator. They all attack your opponent's resources. Same with the Unscrupulous Agent, which makes your opponent's discard. So really what you're trying to do is trade 1-for-1 with your opponent, or, you know, if you get a 2-for-1, obviously go for that. But trade 1-for-1 with your opponent's resources, and then win by outvaluing them with your graveyard and evidence synergies. So as far as colors go, I do try to be mostly green to take advantage of Flourishing Bloomkin, but it will make your Murder and your Undercity Eliminator harder to cast. So if you don't have the Bloomkin, you might want to lean a little bit more towards black, but the good early drops tend to be better in green because of the Nervous Gardener and the Inspector. So with that broad picture in mind, let's dive into the data on 17 lands and when to take the cards, as well as alternatives during a draft. So if you're new here, the thing I like to do first is calculate the total wins created, and I do this by taking the average of the game's played win rate and the game in hand win rate on 17 lands, which is a website that tracks Magic the Gathering data. Then I subtract the average win rate of all of the users in the archetype and multiply it by the number of games played. And what this allows me to do is see, regardless of skill type, player type, etc., what's been working for the majority of people within the archetype. And top of the list here, we have Zoni, Center of the Web, which is no surprise. It is the busted Golgari rare that is worth splashing anytime that you're in black or green. And in Golgari, you don't have to splash for it, so it's even better. Followed by Extract a Confession, Crowl Whipcracker, Loxodon Eavesdropper, A Killer Among Us, Nervous Gardener, Bite Down on Crime, Flourishing Bloomkin, Rubber Belt Maverick, Hide in Plain Sight, Murder, Long Goodbye, Topiary Panther, Deadly Cover-Up, Vidogazi Inspector, and Axebane Feryx. And then we can kind of repeat the same process for the total wins destroyed. And this one, at the top of the list here, we can see a couple of build-around cards that are tempting to... They're not strictly bad, right? Cards that are on the total wins destroyed means that the majority of people who have tried to get them to work have failed, or at least they're like, you know, they can be potential traps. So Insidious Roots and Chalk Outline, if you build your deck around them, they are good. Insidious Roots, whenever you remove a card, you spawn a token, a plant token that then you get all of your plant tokens get +1/+1, and they can get out of control as long as you were removing things from your graveyard. Like Rubber Belt Maverick works particularly well for this. The Gravestone Strider, which is also on this list, works well. So in this data right here, you can kind of see that people have attempted to make the Insidious Roots deck and just haven't quite gotten enough graveyard synergies to make it work. Same thing with Chalk Outline. Chalk Outline spawns a 2/2 as long as you're removing a creature card from your graveyard. Slime Against Humanity is one that, technically speaking, if you get a whole bunch of Slime Against Humanities, you can make it work because they stack on top of each other. If you only get a few copies of it, though, it's not particularly good because you're making a 2/2 for 3, and yeah. Then we've got Rot Farm Mortipede, which I think people have, again, looking at this card, think it's going to be good because it's the one that gets Menace and Lifelink as long as you're removing stuff from your graveyard. And although you do have a collect evidence theme and you are removing stuff from your graveyard, it's hard to do. It's hard to have enough to do every single turn. So keep that in mind, that cards like this that look like they have synergies, unless you are really, really leaning heavily into those synergies, can be a trap. Then we see Repeat Offender, which is the 2/1 that can give itself Suspect and then +1/+1. And this one is just, again, we see this one again and again. It's just too expensive for what it's trying to do. Gravestone Strider, I think, again, it does work with the Insidious Roots and Chalk Outline, but you got to have enough of it to make it work. Rakish Scoundrel, Snarling Gorehound, the Macabre Reconstruction, Clandestine Meddler, it doesn't add up. Case of the Trampled Garden, Assassin's Trophy, which is the rare Golgari that kills something and then gives them a land. Airtight Alibi, Public Thoroughfare, and Slimy Dual Leech. So we can see a couple of things like Snarling Gorehound and the Repeat Offender and the Slimy Dual Leech. Like we want to be defensive, not aggressive. And then, like Rakish Scoundrel is the disguised creature that is the Golgari specific one. And that one is, it's just too expensive for what it's trying to do. And then the Macabre Reconstruction is the kind of graveyard synergies. We want to be using the graveyard, not reanimating the graveyard. So keep that in mind. Same thing with It Doesn't Add Up. That's another one that's a graveyard reanimator spell, and those have not worked particularly well in this archetype. So after doing that, I like to look at the wins created and divide them by the number of times that the card was picked, and graph it against the average taken at, and fit the data with a logarithmic regression. And what this allows me to do is calculate the value over replacement, which was a method created by 2duck3, Magic the Gathering content creator. Thank you, Carl, once again. I will continue to give you shout-outs until the end of time. And what this allows us to do is see which cards are the top cards and by how much at different time points within a draft. So top of the list here, we've got Azoni, Center of the Web. Again, this is the Golgari rare that spawns 2/1 Menace Reach Spider tokens and then has Menace itself and requires 6 blockers to affect, and then creates more tokens again as long as you can collect evidence 4 when it attacks. Vein Ripper is a great bomb as long as you have enough black sources to pay the triple pip black, right? So 3 triple pip black, you definitely want to be majority black if you've got Vein Ripper. And then you get a 6/5 flying ward, sacrifice a creature, and then whenever a creature dies, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So when your opponent decides to finally trade off with your resources, if 5 things die, like it includes theirs too, right? It's not whenever a creature you control dies, it's whenever a creature dies. So this card is impossible to beat sometimes. Because if 4 things die, 5 things die, it's like a 20-point swing all of a sudden, and it's just like, wow, okay, how can I make it back? Hide in Plain Sight has been a really impressive rare. You get two 2/2 cloaked tokens, and you get to choose what they are. So remember that cloaked works with creatures specifically, and so when you look at your top 5, you kind of choose what are the best cards to cloak. And you don't really want to use your spells because you'd like to have your spells in your library in case you reshuffle them with Nervous Gardener. And you're really looking for something that can be a 2/2 body that then also can flip into a creature for its cloaked costs. Deadly Cover-Up is the Wrath in black, and Wraths are good and limited. Axebane Ferrix is a 4/4 Death Touch Haste with Ward Collect 4. This one is really great pressure. I was mentioning that Golgari is not particularly aggressive. if you have Axebane Ferrex, you can afford to be a little bit more aggressive because your opponent is not going to be able to interact with this card early because of the ward, unless they have early ways of collecting evidence, right? Then we've got Homicide Investigator, which is good for the kind of outvaluing your opponent. And even if you just trade this into one of their disguised creatures, you're up in mana because you're trading your 2/2 with their 3-drop, and then you're creating a clue token, which will then help you outvalue your opponent. One of the things that people don't realize in limited, a lot, beginners, I should say, is how much each card gives you an advantage over your opponent. If you can draw one more card than your opponent, I think, I can't remember quite the exact numbers off the top of my head, but it's about a 5% increase in win rate. So if you can draw, 2 more cards, 3 more cards, you eventually just skew it very, very much in your favor, as long as the game is going long enough that you're able to play out all of your cards. So generally, there's a tipping point around turn 5 or so where you start to get the advantage of being on the draw instead of on the play. And so, in a strategy, especially where you're really trying to slow things down, Homicide Investigator is really great. Hunted Bone Brute is another one that's kind of like the Axebane Ferrex. You can have a really aggressive strategy. The problem is it's at rare, but you're not going to be sad to have the Hunted Bone Brute. And technically, on defense, Hunted Bone Brute is fantastic because of the 6 power can trade into something with 6 toughness. And then we've got Sharp-Eyed Rookie, which is another one that can really apply the pressure, and then the Vigilance helps you remain defensive, and this can grow into a large threat. And then as you're doing it, it also creates those clue tokens, which help you outvalue your opponent. And then the Golgari space can splash, and one of the ones that's definitely worth splashing if you happen to pick it up. It is a mythic. Rakdos, Patron of Chaos, is particularly powerful. You get a 6/6 flying trampler, and at the beginning of your end step, your target opponent may sacrifice 2 non-land, non-token permanents. If they don't, you draw 2 cards. So speaking of outvaluing your opponent, Rakdos, Patron of Chaos fits perfectly within that plan. And as a 6-drop, it's easier to splash. Generally, things that are 5-drops and 6-drops are kind of what you're looking for because it gives you that time to find your mana to be able to splash the card. So after that, those are all the good pack 1 pick ones. And what I really enjoy about this process is specifically this one, right? We value Vorp for picks 2.5 through 5. And these are the uncommons and sometimes busted commons that are going to kind of guide you into the archetype. And so top of the list here, we've got like Urgent Necropsy. I had a deck that had like 3 of these. I don't know why exactly people are not super happy about this, but one of the things that's nice about it is the mana value of a disguised card is 0. So when you collect evidence, you can collect evidence 0 if you're targeting a disguised card with this. And then you can destroy up to an artifact, up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target enchantment, and up to 1 target planeswalker. So you can hit a lot of different targets with this. And in a deck that's interested in being the attrition side of things and being controlling, I've been pleasantly surprised with this card. On the flip side, A Killer Among Us is one of those that is definitely more of an aggressively sided card. 3 chump blockers for 5 though is not bad. It does slow the game down. But really where this shines is that you're able to attack in, and then you're attacking in with 2 1/1s and a 4/4. And the game design of this one, of like choosing which one is likely to be the culprit, I've really enjoyed. And then the Flourishing Bloomkin, anytime that you're in green, you have to ask yourself, how green are you? Because Flourishing Bloomkin gets better the more that you are in like a 10-7 split, as far as like 10 green towards 7, whatever your second color is. But because it fetches its own, it doesn't have to be in that. It just is better the more green that you have. So Flourishing Bloomkin, anytime that I'm in green, I'm definitely looking to pick those up. Buried in the Garden works better in green-white because splashing for your fixing is difficult. But this enables further splashing. And so the way that I do this is like count the cards that help you cast white, like you would anything else, like that's not a fixer, right? So like if I have 3 Nervous Gardeners, then I can play a Buried in the Garden pretty much for free, right? And then that Buried in the Garden helps me play off-color stuff. You don't even really need it to be counted as part of your fixing, though, and you shouldn't, I think, for like splashing Rakdos and such. Because like it's removal into ramp, and that's good enough in a deck that wants to get to its later part of its curve. So treat this one more as an off-color bomb rather than fixing. Long Goodbye is particularly good removal in black. You can, as long as your opponent doesn't flip the disguised creature into something that costs 5 or more. Been very impressed with that. And then the Underground Mortuary, and just a note in general, is that because of the disguise costs, you have a lot of tension in your mana. So you have cards that want to flip for double pip black, and you have cards that want to flip for double pip green. And, you know, like I was mentioning, if you're more green, but then you have cards like Murder and Undercity Eliminator, you kind of want to have a 9-9 split or even better. And so the on-color cards, usually your off-color, like usually your cards that allow you to splash for free are valued more highly than the on-color rares or rare lands. And in this set, I've been very impressed with the on-color tap lands. Because they let you run that 9-9 split. Same thing with like the Evolving Wilds or Escape Tunnel that allows you to run a 9-9 so that you can more easily cast things like your Undercity Eliminator. That, you know, this is a great card. When you're playing in Golgari, you can sacrifice a clue token, you can sacrifice a scrupulous agent or unscrupulous agent. You can even sacrifice a Nervous Gardener that's already flipped to find land in a pinch to exile your opponent's stuff, right? Like, there's definitely a reward to having a flexible mana base, and Nervous Gardener is really great. Any cards that help you, so like even if you aren't splashing, Nervous Gardener is great in a 2-color focused Golgari deck that isn't splashing for bombs, because being able to hit your land drops consistently. So once you hit turn 3, this guarantees that you're going to hit into turn 4 on your lands. And one of the things that really affects you is whether or not you are experiencing Screw or Flood, right? So Nervous Gardener is one of those cards that kind of eliminates experiencing Screw, which is nice, because if you get stuck on 3 lands in this set and you can't get to that point where you're threatening, you're attacking in with 5 mana to kind of threaten what your disguised creatures can untap into, you really suffer, right? I think that Screw is so much more detrimental than Flood in this set, and which is why you never see, even in aggressive strategies, you hardly ever see a reason to go below 17 lands. And there are times where 18 lands should be a consideration, especially on the play in best of 3. And then Greenbelt Radical is another one that, like, I don't mind playing this one out just as a 4/4 for 4. The stat block of a 4/4 for 4 is particularly good in this set, where everybody's playing understated creatures with disguise. And then if you do also have the kind of like, all right, how do we actually close out this game? Greenbelt Radical has that ability to be a win condition, because you can flip it up and give that overrun kind of aspect where all of your creatures suddenly have trample and you're pushing in through for a ton of damage. Leering Onlooker I've really enjoyed. Anytime that you're kind of doing the graveyard shenanigans in black, and you can trigger the stuff coming out of your graveyard with the Leering Onlooker. So for the like chalk outlines and the Insidious root stacks and things like that. But then a 1/3 blocker is also just a really great defensive card. So similar to the Inspector in green, this one just shuts down your opponent particularly well, and then has some upside, some synergies potentially later. Archdruid's Charm is another one where it's like the Flourishing Bloomkin, do a check of how green are you, because there are definitely some payoffs to being mostly green in this set, and Archdruid's Charm is one of them. Triple pip green though, so you definitely have to be mainly that color. And then, like I mentioned, there are a couple of splashes that are worth doing, so particularly blue. So keep your eyes out for any of the blue fixing rare lands, because of the Sultai space. There's a lot of synergies within that space. So Undercity Sewers allows you to play some of those good blue cards that we'll cover here shortly. And we've got Soul Innervation, which has been really good removal, especially in an archetype that cares about creature cards leaving your graveyard. So this is kind of like what inspires people to lean into the Insidious roots and the chalk outline. I think I would rather, I would recommend leaning towards Soul Innervation, which, even if you're not particularly good at doing it, it is still a good card whereas Insidious Roots and Chalk Outline can't be a trap. And then we've got Coerce to Kill, which allows you to, it's like an automatic 2-for-1. I really recommend splashing this card anytime that you're in blue and black, blue or black. Because you remove your opponent's biggest threat and then use that to block their second biggest threat or to take removal out of their hand. Hard hitting question, speaking of which, some synergies there, right? If you take your opponent's biggest threat and then use hard hitting question to have it deal damage with its death touch to something else, then you can remove 3 of your opponent's threats. But yeah, hard hitting question's been good removal in green. Push pull is a good removal, but also a potential win condition. So not only can you use it to destroy target tapped creature, but you can also save it. Remember, you can't cast both sides, but you can save it for a 6-cost win where your opponent isn't expecting you to have 2 haste creatures from their graveyard suddenly swinging at them, and there can be some really big and juicy things that you've killed throughout the course of the game in the graveyard. And now we kind of go into the picks 5 through 8, and this is like a good way to judge how healthy is the archetype. Is it overdrafted? Is it underdrafted? And I can say with certainty that Golgari is underdrafted because this is there are 2 lists for the value of a replacement for picks 5 through 8. So we're going to try to go through this as quickly as possible, but there's lots of options, undervalued uncommons and commons that you can look for in this archetype. So you've got Crowl Whipcracker, you've got Extract a Confession, you've got Krosan Tusker, which this one's a list card and kind of works similar to the Topiary Panther. It allows you to draw a card instead of specifically just looking for the land through the cycling, and then it gives you 7 evidence to work with instead of 6. So, if you're interested in the Sultai kind of collect evidence space, then I can definitely recommend the Krosan Tusker. Rubber Belt Maverick, again, has that synergy of being able to exile a creature card specifically from your graveyard. If you are tempted by the dark side into the Insidious Roots and Chalk Outline, then you're definitely going to want to focus on cards like this to make sure that you have a critical number to make things work. I think the lowest that you could possibly go for is like 7, right? Ideally, you want like 9 or 11 to really make sure that you're able to trigger it every single turn. And again, the reason why it was on the most wins, the top of the list for the most wins destroyed, is because people don't get enough synergies within their deck. Loxodon Eavesdropper, I've been impressed with this card in every green archetype. You get a 3/3 Hill Giant that draws you a card, but you do have to split that mana up over time. And then it attacks in as a 4/4 Vigilance, which the 4/4 stat block has worked particularly well in this set. Bite Down on Crime, amazing removal in green. Murder, acceptable removal in black. You're kind of going to have to wait for the right target to come up, but it will eventually come up. Vidogazi Inspector, same thing with the Leering Onlooker. Just early, your 2 drops you want to be looking to live to make it to your 5 drops. So your 1/3 reach, your 1/3 flyers, your defensive cards work particularly well in this archetype, and a 2/4 reach works particularly well at blocking, right? Because of like your dog walkers, your gadget technicians. There's a lot of morph creatures that flip over into 3 power, but not 4. So if you can make this into a 2/4, then you're stopping a lot of your opponent's early pressure until they hit turn 5, where they can start flipping bigger threats. But then you have your murders for turn 5, and like you just kind of do this game where you're answering all of your opponent's stuff, but for slightly cheaper, and then hopefully have a strategy to win in the long run. Fester Leech works really well with the graveyard synergies, being able to fill your graveyard and get that evidence so that you have stuff to use. Once again, I'll say it. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Self-mill is a good thing. If you don't believe it, you've probably been burned by milling a bomb. Every time that you mill a bomb, though, there's a game that should offset that by drawing a bomb only because you milled to it. And you get material for collect evidence, you get information on what your, better idea of what your future top decks are going to be, so you can, plan around that. And, it's free information, but you do occasionally have to watch your best Azoni go into the graveyard and cry a little bit. Glintweaver is amazing stabilization if you can get to 7, and one of the things that's nice about the Flourishing Bloomkins and the Nervous Gardeners is that they help you get to the later part of your curve quite well. So anytime that I'm looking at that, like if you have that synergy, keep in mind that 6 drops and 7 drops become something that's a little bit more achievable than normal. if you have cards that fetch lands. So Glint Weaver, on an empty board, comes down as a 6/6 that gains you 6 life and has reach for 7. So particularly good in a defensive situation. I mentioned Unscrupulous Agent allows you to attack your opponent's hand, is always a 1-for-1 because it makes them discard unless it's later in the game and your opponent has no hand. But if you've gotten to that point, you've done what Golgari is trying to do. And then Nyx Weaver, you get a 2/3 reach at the beginning of your upkeep, mill 2 cards. So like the Fester Leech, this is good for enabling your collect evidence strategies. And then you can return target card from your graveyard to your hand. If you find a busted bomb like a Zoni, then you can actually bring this back with the Nyx Weaver. Topiary Panther, just like the Croson Tusker, works really well to kind of hit your land drops while also filling your graveyard with something that you can use for collect evidence. And then later in the game, you can just play it down as a 6/5 trampler, and there's nothing wrong with that. Get a Leg Up works better if you're going wide, but it's a very good defensive card as well because it allows the creature to have reach. So you can snipe flyers out of the sky that we're expecting to get through. Repulsive Mutation along with Coerced to Kill are the cards that I look to splash the most often in the Golgari space, and that's why, you know, I mentioned the Sultai space. Repulsive Mutation, I think, is better than Doppelgang. Doppelgang is like a turn 8 win. Repulsive Mutation is... you can get a turn 8 win with this as well, because you get the X +1/+1 counters on it, even if you aren't countering something. And then it's like a counter spell, but even if the counter spell part fails, you can still use this to deal X damage as like a Simic Fireball on an unblocked unblocked attacker. So I've been very impressed with Repulsive Mutation. I think you should definitely check it out. And Culver Ambusher, a little bit less so than the Repulsive Mutation. But you still, if you're attacking your opponent's stuff, it's not uncommon for you to be able to flip this up and eliminate their last measly blocker. That's, you know, their Loxodon Eavesdropper, and if you get some line, sometimes it lines up nicely. Crowd Control Warden, again, this is another one that's like, it's better the more go wide that you are, but it's a good kind of mid to late game threat, and I prefer it over the Crocodile because it can be a bigger one, especially if you can figure out how to give it trample, which we'll get to shortly. The Sanguine Savior, flipping up to give lifelink, is particularly good, especially on defense. And then Escape Tunnel, even if I'm not splashing an off-color bomb, I've enjoyed the Escape Tunnel. Again, I think a 9/9 split in your mana base is much more important. And then, you know, if you have like a Crowd Control Warden that's disguised, you can make it unblockable and then flip it up for a ton of damage. And then we've got Slice from the Shadows, which is good if you are in a defensive deck. It's a little bit more awkward because you're always going to be trading down in value to an extent, right? If you target a warded creature that they played for 3, then you can play it on parity because you don't have to pay the ward cost. But if they play something like Loxodon, then you're going to have to be paying 4 to remove it. Again, that's not a great example. So often this is like a heat ray. What I'm trying to get at is X and a red or X and a black usually is trading down in value. In this set, not so much. But it's good. It's good defensive removal. And then Night Drinker Mori is another one that is the double pip in black can be a little bit hard if you are majority green, but a 4/2 flyer is a way to kind of win out the game and attack into your opponent's resources. Okay, that was a long list. Sorry, I got a little caught up there. And then last but not least, we go over the value over replacement for picks 8 and onward, and these are the cards that you can take advantage of wheeling. So usually you want this to be about 3 or so. So the fact that there are 7 on this list, again, points to there being more, to the archetype being underdrafted, right? And it's, it's not uncommon for everybody to pile on to the aggro strategy, and then later in the format everybody kind of figures out what's worth splashing and like how to get the multicolored space to work and what cards are good defensively and whether or not, is 4 toughness actually enough or do we need 5, etc. So at this point, we've kind of figured out the format, and I really love the Golgari Sultai space. I think that there's a lot of value there that's going underlooked while everybody's overdrafting Boros and white. So Fairy Snoop is something that you can look to pick up. It's nice, the 1/4 flyer is a nice defensive body, and then the card advantage of flipping it up is relevant in an archetype that's trying to outvalue your opponent with cards. Toxin Analysis works well, I think, with the Fairy Snoop. Anything that, like the problem of your 2/4 blocker, your 1/4 blocker, is that you're not getting things off of the board. Toxin Analysis changes that, and then also gives you a clue token, so it replaces itself, and you're not trading down in card advantage to answer your opponent's threats. Vengeful Creeper is another one that I really like. The Vengeful Creeper, I think that it's awesome that it wheels, because you get this kind of, you can play it out as a gray ogre that then flips for 6 into a decent mid-range threat like the Crocodile and the Crowd Control Warden. But then it also has the ability to destroy an artifact or enchantment, which works particularly well with like Makeshift Bindings and Buried in the Gardens. There are some really good enchantments to hit with the Vengeful Creeper, and often you do get value off of that part of it. Like I mentioned, They Went This Way. You can use it, especially, I would save They Went This Way only for if you are fixing, right? If you're doing the multicolored thing, then I like to pick up They Went This Way, and it's something that you can try to pick up on the wheel. The one downside with this is that it is a very slow card, so you're not going to want to play this on turn 3 in a lot of games. It does ramp you to turn 5, so of course there are going to be some games where you want to do that. But if you don't do anything until turn 3 and you do They Went This Way, you're not doing anything until you're not developing the board until turn 4. And like, this is going to be too slow even against other Golgari archetypes. So a lot of times I've found, like, unless you did a turn 2 Inspector or a turn 2 Leering Onlooker or something that's going to like hold the fort down until turn 5, you're going to want to try to do They Went This Way, I think, more for fixing rather than ramp. Just my personal opinion. And then, but it does replace itself with a clue token, which is nice. And then Riftburst Hellion, just like the Crowd Control Warden and the Crocodile, having these gray ogres that then turn into these mid to late game threats. It's a way to get additional stuff in the later part of your curve, while not making it overcrowded, because you can play it as a 3-drop in a pinch, right? So just like adventures that we've seen in the past, it allows you to kind of extend the later part of your curve by playing these cards that you can play earlier. Fanatical Strength, like I mentioned, there are a couple of cards that you really want to give trample to, especially your big beef, and Fanatical Strength is a great way to do that, and it's a card that not everybody likes, so you can pick these up on the wheel. And then last but not least, we've got the Undercover Crocodile. And again, like I mentioned, I think that I prefer the other big disguise creatures to the Undercover Crocodile, but it is still one that, like, it wheels. You can usually pick up one. You usually want one copy, and it does give you the clues if it does connect, which helps you outvalue your opponent, which works well in the kind of the Golgari, Sultai, collect evidence, outvalue space. So tomorrow I'll be covering the last archetype before I take a break, and until I return for Outlaws at Thunder Junction in April. And once again, thanks for nerding out and going on this deep dive with me, and I hope it helps you get those trophies. Thank you, Fabian, so much for joining as a YouTube member. I greatly, greatly appreciate the support. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And to all of you who are not YouTube members, you can click that join button, and I tried to put some interesting things in there. So let me know, if that seems appealing, or if you have an idea of something that could be added to make it appealing, right? I thought the suggestion for battles against other members was kind of interesting. So remember to hit like and subscribe, and thank you for listening to my ramblings and being a part of my community. I'll see you tomorrow.